I'm Kate Clark-LeMay. I'm the acting senior historian at the National Portrait Gallery and the interim director of Portal, the Portrait Gallery's scholarly center. My colleague Jackie and I have worked really hard on our programming, and we have a great presentation tonight entitled Printing the Revolution, Conversation with Carmen Ramos and Claudia Zapata. So this lecture will be presented by Dr. Carmen Ramos and Claudia Zapata. Dr. Ramos is the former chief curator and curator of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And congratulations, the newly appointed Chief Curatorial and Conservation Officer at the National Gallery of Art. Zapata is the curatorial assistant at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And we are so fortunate to have the Q&A moderated by my colleague at the Portrait Gallery, Dr. Taína Caragol, who's the Portrait Gallery's curator of painting and sculpture and Latinx art and history. Before we begin, we'd like to give a land acknowledgement. Although we are tuning in together today from different places, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in these places today. We also recognize the inherent flaws of portraiture. Since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's flaws as well as its strengths. The National Portrait Gallery strives to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. We are pleased to present today's event as part of the Greenberg-Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. We extend our gratitude to Susan Steinhauser and to her late husband, Dan Greenberg, who are the sponsors for tonight's program, for their generosity, which makes this ongoing virtual conversation series possible. So if you're just joining us now, please use the chat function and please let us know from where you are watching. And we'd like to just give some ground rules. The Q&A feature will be where you submit questions to be answered during the Q&A that Taína, Dr. Caragol, will be moderating after the presentation. So go ahead and familiarize yourselves with the chat Q&A. And I'm now going to introduce our guests. Dr. Carmen Ramos is the newly appointed Chief Curatorial and Conservation Officer at the National Gallery of Art. Prior to joining the National Gallery, Dr. Ramos served as the Smithsonian American Art Museum's acting head curator and curator of Latinx art. In over 10 years at the American Art Museum, Dr. Ramos dramatically expanded the museum's collection of Latinx art with an eye toward capturing its expansive range and rootedness within US art and culture. In addition to Printing the Revolution, her exhibitions at SAM include Tamayo, the New York Ears in 2017, Down These Mean Streets, Community and Place in Urban Photography from 2017, and Our America, the Latino Presence in American Art in 2013, which included a multi-city US tour to 8 museums. That's amazing. The accompanying catalog received a 2014 Co-First Prize Award for Excellence by the Association of Art Museum Curators. Dr. Ramos earned a bachelor's degree from New York University and a master's degree and a doctorate from the University of Chicago. Claudia Zapata is a curatorial assistant of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and is a doctoral candidate at Southern Methodist University. They received their BA and MA in art history from the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in classic Maya art. Zapata has curated exhibitions at Mexic Arte Museum in Austin and other Texas institutions. They have published articles in Panhandle Plains Historical Review, Joyas, Atlan, Hemisphere, and El Mundo Zurdo Siete. Their recent essay, Chicanx Art in the Digital Age, is featured in the Printing the Revolution, The Rise and Impact of Chicano Graphics, 1965 to now exhibition catalog. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Taína Caragol. Dr. Caragol is curator of painting and sculpture and Latinx art and history at the National Portrait Gallery. Her scholarship focuses on Latinx and Latin American art and its institutional and market validation, as well as on the recovery of histories suppressed by colonialism. Since her hiring in 2013, she has significantly increased the representation of Latinx historical figures and artists at the Portrait Gallery through acquisitions and by co-curating or curating exhibitions such as One Life, Dolores Huerta, Unseen, Our Past in a New Light, Ken Gonzalez Day and Titus Kafar, and the Outwind 2019, American Portraiture Today. Upcoming shows include 1898, US Imperial Visions and Revisions, co-curated with yours truly, and the Outwind 2022, which she will direct and co-curate with Dr. Leslie Urena. Dr. Caragol has a BA in Modern Languages from the University of Puerto Rico, an MA in French Studies from Middlebury College, and a PhD in Art History from the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Okay, wow, that was a lot, but we're so excited for our guests today. And now let's turn to the lecture itself. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. E. Carmen Ramos and Claudia Zapata.
Thank you. Thank you, Taína, Kate, and Jacqueline for inviting Claudia and I to speak about portraiture in the exhibition, Printing the Revolution, the Rise and Impact of Chicano Graphics, 1965 to now, which considers how the Civil Rights era set the foundation for a really significant, prolific, and politically engaged graphic arts movement that continues to thrive today over 5 decades later among artists of Mexican descent in the United States and their cross-cultural collaborators. We're really excited to be here and to talk about this facet of the exhibition. I'm going to share my screen so I can start. Okay. It was very early during my research into this exhibition that I noticed the prevalence of portraiture in the work of Chicano artists. Rupert Garcia is a pivotal artist in this regard, and here I'm showing his 1975 portrait of Frida Kahlo, which was one of the first images of the revered Mexican artist by a Chicano artist. In fact, Lucy Lepard, writing in 1990 on the occasion of a solo exhibition of Garcia's work at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, discussed what she and others have called Garcia's quote-unquote ideological portraits. She notes, quote, "These are images intended to bring injustice and radical change to life, to bring the faces of history's third world protagonists up to the screens of the dominant culture. At their best, the ideological portraits are icons, even monuments, to the accomplishments and sometimes sufferings of those portrayed, as well as visual homage to their intellectual and social courage," end quote. I too see a deep tie between portraiture and history. In the hands of Chicanx artists, portraiture, a category commonly associated with wealth and privilege, becomes a pedagogical medium that shifts attention away from personal aggrandizement and vanity to activism, sacrifice, and social memorialization. Presented in art centers, protest signs, and in the home and on the streets, images provide viewers with portraits of change makers and an entry into historical events that they help shape. We highlight portraiture in a dedicated section in our exhibition, which we've titled Change Makers. These works highlight how the Civil Rights era was a moment of transformation in the very way we conceive of history. The struggle to create a just world is also about whose experiences we value, whose history is considered important and deemed worthy of recording in history books, discussing in classrooms, and preserving in museums like NPG and SAM. These efforts also unmasked the ways in which racism, imperialism, colonialism, sexism, classism, and homophobia shaped the historical narratives we collectively inherited. The first wall shows portraits of activists, artists, and scholars, including revolutionary leaders like José Martí, who fought against Spanish colonialism in the Americas in the 19th century, the radical Puerto Rican nationalist Lolita Lebrón, the Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said, known for his key role in developing the field of post-colonial studies, and activists who fought for civil and human rights for Black people, like Dr. Martin Luther King and Angela Davis. The second wall portrays influential artists like the Mexicans José Guadalupe Posada and Frida Kahlo, the Tejana singer Selena, who was tragically killed in 1995, and labor activists and leaders inside and out of the Chicano community, including Joe Hill, Dolores Huerta, and Emma Tenayuca. Many of the prints are especially layered, functioning as more than one thing simultaneously. The National Caucus of Chicano Social Scientists, later known as the National Association of Chicana and Chicano Studies, commissioned Rupert Garcia to create an event poster for one of their first convenings in the 1970s. They supplied Garcia with a defiant photograph of Emma Tenayuca, standing with a bright smile in front of a jail cell. This young labor organizer and community activist led a successful pecan seller strike in San Antonio in the 1930s. This print is especially layered, functioning both as a promotional image for an event, but also a pedagogical tool in and of itself, sparking awareness of Tenayuca, who at the time was a little-known historical figure. In fact, she is still known only within certain circles, despite her groundbreaking activism as a woman and Mexican American. Several works in the exhibition poignantly integrate carefully chosen quotations, which were intended to pique viewers' interest in the sitter, their deeds, and values. Jesus Barraza of the collective Dignidad Rebelde depicts Steve Biko, one of the most outspoken South African critics of apartheid, who was killed in 1977. Everything is carefully orchestrated in this print, from the bold, flat graphic style of the print, which creates a memorable, attention-grabbing, simplified image, to the artist's use of red, green, and black, the colors of the Pan-African flag, a symbol of Black liberation. And the way in which Barraza quotes Biko from one of his most important speeches, White Racism and Black Consciousness, recited in 1971, that urged Black South Africans to consider how colonial and racist worldviews shaped their own perception of Black life and culture. But portraiture is prevalent throughout the show. Some likenesses, like that of Che Guevara, as seen here in works by Rupert Garcia and Mario Torero, respectively, function more like icons that are quickly identifiable as global symbols of political resistance. Others are profound considerations of our current times. One of the most elaborate works in the exhibition is Sandra Fernandez's Mourning and Dreaming High, con Muchafe, created between 2014 and 2018, when public discussions about dreamers and their fate were at a high point during the final years of the Obama administration and the initial years of the Trump administration. This is one instance the specific historical identities of the sitters is not emphasized, and instead the artist works through various printmaking processes to render her sitters less clear and obscured. She prints their likenesses on the age pages of an 18th century English law book, documenting cases of treason, high crimes, and misdemeanors, an implied reference to how dreamers and other undocumented immigrants are criminalized in today's public sphere. The intensely worked prints include bits of papers, milagros, small metal objects in the form of saints and other symbols that are believed to impart protection in times of need, and the artist's own hand stitching to emphasize the humanity and vulnerability of her anonymous sitters. By installing the prints in the shape of a 13th century Jerusalem cross that presents dreamers as the new crusaders, the artist conjures several temporalities at once, encouraging viewers to consider how the future will judge our collective action or inaction. Even before the unjust murder of George Floyd and the worldwide protests that ensued, Our exhibition planned to feature works that addressed police brutality and the ways in which artists have used portraiture to make the individual and communal toll of this struggle more visible. One of the most emotive prints in the exhibition is this work by Amado Peña that tells the tragic story of the killing of Santos Rodriguez in 1973, a 12-year-old boy who was killed by a police officer who tried to coerce a confession from him and his brother using Russian roulette. Peña's memorial print honors the boy and other victims of violence whose names appear beneath Rodriguez's bloodied face. Peña likely based his print on this school portrait of Santos. Our exhibition opens with a site-specific installation that addresses police brutality today by Ori Original. This Bay Area artist began his Justice for Our Lives series in 2014 in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement as a way to remember and mourn people killed by the police and other forms of law enforcement. The project started with the portrait of Oscar Grant, the young Black man who was killed in 2019 by a BART police officer in Oakland. Sadly, Ori Original has created 100 portraits, some familiar names that many of us recognize from the news, and others who may be more recognized within certain regions or communities, like these two portraits of children who died while in custody of the US Customs and Border Protection. To create his likenesses, the artist often reached out to victims' families to request a photograph, and from these, he creates simple black and white digital portraits, which he prints and repastes sometimes in elaborate, colorful arrangements on urban surfaces throughout the Bay Area. His portraits, which portray people full of life, capture the personal style and individuality of his now deceased subjects. He also makes his portraits available for download on his website and encourages users to circulate them on social media and print them for use in protests or in urban interventions. The project, which the artist continued to expand until the end of 2020, with portraits devoted to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, among others, speaks to a long history of solidarity movements between marginalized groups in the Bay Area. Original portrays Black, Asian, Latinx, Native, disabled, transgender, and migrant people, highlighting how police brutality especially affects politically and economically marginalized groups. These latter portraits go beyond major historical figures to capture the likenesses of everyday people who have left their mark on the world, often through tragedy. Thank you. I'd like to turn the table over now to my colleague, Claudia Zapata.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Carmen. In Printing the Revolution, we recognize the additional digitally informed chapter of Chicanx graphics in our final gallery section titled Digital Innovations and Public Interventions. In this section, we highlight new digital printing methods, born digital art, or works produced entirely in a digital format, and augmented reality prints. In addition to highlighting the experimentation informing these digitally based works, we contextualize the pivotal role technological shifts have played for artists, allowing for broader visibility and increased user interaction. Rupert Garcia, one of the most renowned graphic artists of the civil rights era, continues his graphics practice by creating digitally based works printed at the Oakland Fine Art Print Studio Magnolia Editions with master printer Donald Farnsworth. The inkjet technology to print this new approach to Garcia's multiples consists of a non-impact method where liquid ink prints a vertical row of pixels to capture high-quality, vivid color prints. The 2010 print Obama from Douglas exemplifies Garcia's now preferred printing practice as he steps away from the physical demands of screen printing. In this new digitally informed work, he continues the use of diptych and triptych formats that define his practice. He interweaves vector-based graphics and digital photographs, inviting viewers to connect the historic relationships between portraits, such as abolitionist and first high-ranking Black U.S. government official Frederick Douglass, and Barack Obama, the 44th and first Black president of the United States. The Internet and Web 2.0 a broad term denoting a web iteration defined by user participation and interactive experiences, result in a major shift for Chicanx art due to the social network boom in the aughts. These emergent technologies facilitated wider networked image distribution for political advocacy we define as shareable graphics. Chicanx shareable graphics are digital images disseminated online to aid in solidarity efforts and create digital allyship, building support often for marginalized communities. In 2011, Fabiana Rodriguez and Cesar Maxit created the shareable graphic to rally against the spread of the Secure Communities, or SCOM, immigration enforcement program. By looking to Shepard Fairey's Hope graphic that defined the Obama campaign in 2008, Rodriguez and Maxit recall the community expectations and exaltation in Obama's historic win to become the first Black president. Altering the original portrait's ponderous pose and signature horizon logo, the artist presents the carceral realities of 1 million deportations under the Obama administration. Interesting to note, the artist eventually revisited this graphic, updating the 1 million header to the eventual 2 million statistic. Immigrant activists' condemnation of the Obama administration's high record of deportations eventually led to the widely circulated moniker for the president, Deporter-in-Chief. Fellow artist-activist or artivist Julio Salgado uses social media and the blogosphere to highlight queer immigrants. As a mentee of Fabiana Rodriguez and a queer undocumented artist, Salgado is part of an artivist community that aims to rethink immigrant movement branding by redefining the intersectional communities that fundamentally comprise it. In 2012, Julio Salgado used the microblogging site Tumblr to reach out to undocumented and queer communities using the intersectional term undocuqueer for his I Am Undocuqueer project. The original post called for undocumented queer immigrants to provide a photo of themselves along with a personal reflection of what it means to be undocuqueer. Emphatic responses reflected the relief of exposure, as in the caption for I Am Undocuqueer Reina W. Coming out of the shadowy closet, undocumented and queer, join me. Coming out of the closet is a recurring metaphor that the LGBTQ plus community closely aligns with the personal process of coming to terms with and sharing of one's own sexual identity. In this context, the metaphor suggests the additional variable of repressive existence for the undocuqueer. Tumblr followers could receive high-resolution versions of this series' artworks by emailing the artist directly or freely resharing the digital images online. This shareable ethos continues with the work of Lalo Alcaraz. In 2018, Alcaraz posted his I Stand with Emma image after high school senior Emma Gonzalez gave their impassioned speech on live television, advocating for stronger gun control. He then posted it on his social media channels, asking people to distribute it online or download a high-resolution file from his website for personal printing. The image features a portrait of Gonzalez along with We Call BS, a reference to their speech in which they called out government officials for the lack of gun reform. In the lower register, the hashtags gun control now and stand with the kids add to the social media-centered trending tags like hashtag never again, used by Parkland survivors to lobby for solidarity. This transmedial distribution and subsequent recreation of the artwork by the user defines the portrait of Gonzalez as an open source artwork. Open source is primarily associated with software sources that owners make freely accessible to the general public for redistribution and modification at no cost. Artists are echoing the software's iterative capabilities by allowing their images to be redistributed and altered, with users resharing the original image in varying sizes, context, and captions. The user's captions play a critical role in their own created metadata that may interlink the image with other causes or allow the user to create their own critical folksonomies that may project the image into unforeseen online spaces. Augmented reality or AR technological capabilities allow a new multi-layered experience for the viewer, creating a new narrative format that allows users to see a virtual object, animation, or recording overlaid on a base image. Using hardware such as a smartphone or tablet with a camera and an AR app, users access a previously unseen layer to artworks. Chico Gonzalez employed augmented reality to provide an additional narrative layer for viewing his works on paper. For example, users access the enhancements by downloading the previous HP Reveal app to activate video interviews, as in his 2019 work, Salam. The print's composition triggered the AR app to access an oral history with Mexican-Pakistani activist Saida Islam, where she discussed the beauty of the Islamic faith and the conflicting emotions regarding her identities as both a Muslim and Mexican being constantly under attack. These AR experimentations are part of Gonzalez's ongoing portraiture series featuring social activists throughout history. These AR-centered portraits act as a multimedia hub, allowing engaged viewers to learn about the featured sitter, blurring the experiential line between political graphic, documentary, and video art. El Paso artist Zeke Benya worked with David Figueroa of Augment El Paso in Texas to develop the augmented reality screen print A Nomad in Love. Using the free Augment El Paso app and positioning the camera on their devices in front of the AR print, viewers experience the integrated overlaid animations. The app triggers several animated sequences, including a hummingbird that rapidly flutters, motion lines that emit from a spring-necked self-portrait, and a personified coyote with a visible heart that howls against a rotating rabbit-shaped moon. Benya often uses the coyote as a double for himself, given their shared love of running around in the El Paso desert and playful personalities. Grounded in Benya's illustration practice in comics and zines, he now uses digital animations to narrativize his constructed worlds. These many artistic explorations in the digital turn signal a continued artistic curiosity, as well as a strategic capitalization of communities grounded in technological accessibilities. There's a paradoxical finality to the binarial implications of digital creations, coupled with the unbridled subjectivity of personal communication and online forums. Chicanx artists' contributions to these technological tensions and historical moments must be recognized as part of a new chapter in graphics innovations. It is also important to realize these graphics rely on the long-standing motivations begun in the early Chicano movement, where communities carved out their own space and relied on whatever resources were available to aid in the ongoing efforts for social justice. Now, in the digital age, Chicanx artists have an unimaginable opportunity to create a nuanced, discursive artistic practice that may incorporate and reach the many voices they continue to uplift. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carmen and Claudia, for your amazing presentations. Congratulations on your groundbreaking exhibition, which is beautiful and fascinating historically, and goes until the present, as we've seen in both of your presentations. It's a real visual banquet, the show, and the innovative character of all these artists and their social commitment is in full display. And so congratulations for bringing that to all of us to see. Something that I find really fascinating about the show is to have it precisely in the space of our shared building. In a museum, in a building that also houses the National Portrait Gallery, and where very often the notion of portraiture is very much based on the individual, right? And I think you were talking about that at the very beginning of your presentation, Carmen. I find very interesting the idea of the individual and the collective in your show. Individual portraiture is very present in the work of Chicano artists of the 60s and 70s. And in the Chicano tradition, however, the individual often stands as a representative for the collective. And so I think this is related to the notion of ideological portraiture that you discussed of loosely part 2. So we have, for example, Barbara Carrasco's portrait of Dolores Huerta. You know, I'm not talking about 60s and 70s here, but certainly a leader that grew in importance in that moment. And Barbara's print from the 1990s honors her and honors that tradition. And Dolores stands for her achievements in labor in the labor struggle, but also for all the peasants, for the union, really. And equally, Emiliano Zapata, his portrait stands as a transnational symbol of land rights and of Mexican culture and of the land rights of all peasants. So to me, this is a very singular use of portraiture that goes against the elite agenda, as you were saying, Carmen, at the beginning of your presentation. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that relationship between the collective and the individual?
Yeah, I think that it goes really to the heart of the use of the word revolution in our title, right? If you think about what revolution means, it can mean a change in the way you think about something, right? So that implies something very personal, very internal, but it is also about, pressure and, on society to live up to its values or to challenge the values that it has. So I think a lot of the portraits, in our show really speak to that, relationship, between the need to change the way we think about things, we think about the world as individuals, and how individuals have helped us, think society in very different ways. So they're very, very deeply intertwined, and they're, these notions are also deeply related to the 60s moment, which was a moment of collective action, right? It was a moment where collective politics was needed to change laws, numbers allowed us, the force of numbers allowed us to create change, right? The March on Washington, we remember the March on Washington in part, from the photographs of, thousands and thousands and thousands of people that came to Washington, to demand civil rights. So it's a collective, moment that we all understand but have to internalize as individuals. And I think a lot of the works in our exhibition, in many ways, speak as personal statements, but because they're prints, that in and of itself, they're multiples that are circulated and distributed, they become collective in their very form. So I think, these concepts are, deeply intertwined on a number of levels.
Right, I love that. I love the conceptual unity between the print of the individual that is disseminated and then becomes the collective. And Claudia, I am wondering about that relationship of the collective and the individual in relation to artists of this moment. Some of the artists that you both discussed, but some of the artists in particular who are working on digital prints. And is there perhaps a reversal in strategy? I have the impression that in the works of Ori Original, of Sandra Fernandez, there is, instead of a focus on the individual leader, a focus on the anonymous or on the many different faces that then through their work, through the printmaking process, become a sign of a struggle that needs to take shape in our society, that is imminent, or a crisis of society.
Great question. So kind of contextualizing in the digital turn really needs to emphasize the role of text as part of revolutionary actions. For example, like the metadata, like hashtags, for example, that play such a critical role in decentering individuals acting as these iconic figures for revolutions, to the point where it's almost hagiographic veneration over time. I think there's this decentering with like, say, her name, Me Too, Black Lives Matter. There's not this iconicity associated with one person or the group of people. I mean, there's some of that with Black Lives Matter, with Alicia, Patrice, and Opal Tometi, but they're not this trio that's constantly emphasized in portraiture. It's rather this collective grieving that happens with the previously unknown person. I think there's so much reclamation that needs to be done, that is done by a lot of the digital artists. There's this immediacy once the story gets out, this narrative of someone's untimely death, and there's an immediate portraiture that's created usually by the community or some reaction that's usually oftentimes digitally born, and it serves less as this historiographic person that we need to constantly uplift, because I mean they're faulted, everybody is, they're human, but it becomes this altar space really digitally where you can recognize and have this collective grief. So it becomes a hub rather than this kind of like baseball playing card type of way of thinking about portraiture. It's constantly growing upon itself. And there's so many modifications really that are done to these images. When I reference the open source artwork term and the modifications that the user has, whenever something's reshared in this digital context, there's really a signature that's left by each user in some capacity. There's some textual reflection. There may be even, unfortunately, altering of colors, which, it's not ideal, but we're all seeing it differently, but it's kind of the same image, but it's technically all different. You're seeing it on a desktop with a certain resolution, your phone with a specific operating system, tablet, you name it. It lives in all these different formations, and that's what I mean by that. Where I think, kind of thinking about historical portraits, oftentimes that you think of a painting, and that's it. And there's this very specific professionalization and a commercial aspect to commissioning one's portrait and how you decide to be remembered, and there's this grandiosity to it usually where it's just huge and overwhelming, where it's interesting that these digital files, in this case of the digital turn and portraiture, they're really small. You're seeing it very small. Usually it's at a completely different level, but it echoes, as Carmen was saying about the multiple, it echoes in this way, and it reverberates because people are creating this solidarity that is very visible in the digital sense, because oftentimes there's metrics associated with it, like how many shares. It becomes, and not to evoke epidemiological connotations in this day and age, but it becomes viral. And so the breadth of this image and this portrait, even though it's this big, can take over the global sphere at this point, depending on its strength by the community in uplifting it. So it's a different thing beyond just this rectangle or square of a portrait, painting. It has this other life,
Right.
and you have to contextualize it in this space. And oftentimes it's not someone you knew for years and years and years. It's like this brand new person that is an everyday person that is now carrying the weight of a community's memory and grief all in one in this act. It's a very unique experience that didn't exist that long ago. So we're constantly defining it, trying to articulate that.
Fascinating, because it speaks to a change in probably in a change in how social causes are led in our time, and a change, of course, in communication and the dissemination of information that has come with social media. And so I find that really fascinating. And the metadata aspect that you mentioned too, as a metric, and the metrics, the shares as a new kind of way of, we don't have with a digital print perhaps an exact run number, but then there's a way of measuring circulation to a certain extent. I want to encourage our audience to pose questions on the Q&A chat. We have a question here. The question is, are the videos that the United Farm Workers are posting on social media being turned into digital portraits. Do you know what videos are referring to? No?
I'm not familiar with those videos.
Okay. Me neither. So I am very interested in the aspect of shared struggles of the 1960s and 70s, and that large field of what was then called third world solidarity that is very present in your show, and I think exists until today, and that's also in evidence in your show, and it sort of, yeah, it adopts causes of our day. But could you speak a little bit to the diversity of causes that are championed by the artists? And Carmen, you were talking a little about the figures in your portrait section and some of that. But I think very often culturally specific movements like the Chicano movement or the Nuyorican movement are often dismissed by non-specialists as just movements completely self-centered or focused on their own issues. And that was absolutely not the case for the Chicano movement or for the Nuyorican movement or for Puerto Rican prints movement of the 60s and 70s too. Can you speak to that, Carmen, please?
Sure, sure. Of course, the Chicano civil rights movement was, as you said, really part of a much larger global movement, of third world liberation. And artists came of age during a real turning point in global history, during the war in Vietnam, right after the Cuban Revolution, two movements that really had huge ripple effects, around the world. And Chicanos and their collaborators really saw themselves as part of these, global movements that were ushering, change, largely through efforts of solidarity and pronouncements of solidarity. And those two events, right, the Cuban Revolution and the Vietnam War, were really, essential. And they led to so many other ways in which, Chicanx artists and their collaborators, saw themselves as part of this global movement. So the print in our exhibition, for instance, by Linda Lucero, that depicts Lolita Lebron, the radical Puerto Rican, nationalist who fought for Puerto Rican independence. She becomes aware of Lolita Lebron because Lucero is part of the Venceremos Brigade, which is a group of students from the United States, which included many Chicanos, who went to Cuba, in the 70s largely, to help, build buildings in Cuba, to help with agriculture, in part because they believed in the goals of the Cuban Revolution. And it was, during those trips, that individuals like Linda Lucero, Juan Fuentes is another artist in our exhibition that was part of the Venceremos Brigade, that they were exposed to how post-revolutionary Cubans really were actively, building these solidarity networks around the world, with Puerto Ricans, with Palestinians, with South Africans, with, other African groups. So that experience of just even, visiting Cuba was a real eye-opener, for many artists who started to see themselves and their connection with the world. And there were constant, moments and periods of exchange, so there are, instances of the work of Emory Douglas, for example, that was being printed in Cuba, as part of the history of Cuban revolutionary posters. So his work was appropriated and disseminated around the world. So there was this kind of solidarity, the solidarity movement in multiple directions, and which was, extremely, extremely powerful. And I think another facet of this, of our exhibition, that sometimes gets a little lost, is the ways in which we wanted to present really the influential nature of Chicano graphics. I have been using the phrase Chicano, Chicano artists or Chicanx artists and their cross-cultural collaborators to kind of convey how this movement of Chicano graphics included so many people from so many walks of life, right? And had a huge impact on Latinx artists, on artists from other communities, like Joss Sances, who's an Italian-American artist, like Nancy Holm, who's an Asian-American artist in San Francisco. Again, so there were these intercultural, transcultural, multicultural networks, in places like San Francisco, which, as you know, is a small city with many communities that are living in close contact with each other, which in and of itself kind of fueled these solidarity movements. So I think solidarity could be read in sort of, multiple ways, politically, but also kind of working together, even within an art context. And that influence within the Chicano community really projects forward. That's one of the reasons why, we show the work of the Dominican York Proyecto Gráfica that was founded by Pepe Coronado and others, in part on the example of Chicano print centers. And DYPG then really is founded in New York, right? So it's bringing that history and that impact all across, all across the continent to the other side, to the East Coast. So it's a huge impact.
That is just incredible to think about well, those interconnected struggles, that consciousness of interconnected struggles, and also of how the work circulated and how artists impacted each other. I had no idea that Emory Douglas's work had circulated in Cuba, and that's fascinating. We have some questions from the audience. The first one is, has there been any noticeable specific trend in the representation of Chicanidad in print through the years, either visually or conceptually? Great question.
I just want to acknowledge the differences in terms of queer identities, for example, and Chicanx graphics, and just the term Chicanx, adding this non-gender binary ending to Chicano, which is unfortunately still controversial for some individuals. But I think there's this connotation of Chicano art looking a very specific way. And that unfortunately causes this knee-jerk phrase that I've heard before in the past: Chicano art is dead. And it's hard to hear when you are interacting with so many artists who still use that term, and that you still want that identity attached to their artwork, and they see it as a badge of honor, not this kind of relic of the past. And I think there's just new content, like Julio Salgado and his work that is called Quiero mis curse, where he talks about wanting a quinceañera as a young boy, but as a gay man, as a gay person, he wasn't allowed to have it, because quinceañeras are primarily for young girls when they're turning 15. And so this print that's in the show features Julio kind of in both roles as a chambalan and basically the person who would be having a quinceañera. It's a duality that's referencing Frida's work, Las Dos Fridas. And that work recently was posted on Smithsonian social media. And it was interesting because I always look at those to see what the comments are. And there was actually quite a backlash. I remember one of the comments said, "Get mugrero," which translates to like gross, or it's like this gross thing, And it's hard to see those things because you realize Because in my mind, we're already there. We're way past this. Like this is, we now need to go even further into thinking about trans identities, just disability. We need to go. We're just like we need to get way in there. We're still behind, unfortunately, and it's a matter of continuing to promote these images and uplift these images because artists are making them. They are creating this, not necessarily a diversity, but recognizing the communities that always existed, but that may not have had the vocabularies for it, the safety for it. Because when you think about, and that's why it's challenging when you do study Chicano art, and the graphics in particular, you often see this representation of this idealization of living, and it often evokes this family. I always see this family scene where it's a very muscular man and then a woman, and she usually has a child, and then maybe another child, and everyone's very muscular. Like this kind of like body dysphoria as well. But I don't like those images, and I know why they're there. You know, they're trying to create this positive image, but for me, it's just something that's so archaic, and it's non-representative of the actual communities, because Chicanx communities are so diverse. And so I think there's going to be a constant recognition of these people who do not fit a heteronormative template of how they exist, that will be more recognized and that have been obviously recognized in the artwork. And I think it's a matter of just continuing to challenge that person who sees these images and thinks they're disgusting. Like, we still have quite a bit of work to do, even at this base level of challenging what it is to look like a family, or what it is to look like a pair, or what love is.
Thank you, Claudia. Another question. Can you speak to the resonance of Frida Kahlo, and you spoke a little bit about that a moment ago, among Chicanx and Latinx communities? How do you put her legacy in conversation with someone like Emma Tenayuca in terms of action and the way that their iconography circulates?
That's a good question. I'll just maybe take the historical side, and maybe Claudia can talk about her relation to Emma Tenayuca, or I guess in my mind I was thinking Emma Gonzalez, but maybe I just read that into the question. You know, I think one of the inclusion of the Rupert Garcia print really allows us to highlight, you know, really the important role that Chicano artists played, Chicano and Chicana artists played in really bringing Frida into our public consciousness, into our awareness. You know, they were the ones that really shined a light on her, and the ways in which they did that was multifaceted. You know, in speaking to Rupert Garcia about, you know, why he created this print in 1975, which was one of the earliest prints of Frida, you know, he talked about her political activism, right? That's one of the things that made her so significant for Chicano artists, that they identified, you know, with her political activism. She was a member of the Communist Party, right? And her deep commitment to notions of, you know, mestizaje, and, you know, the mestizaje, the cultural mixture, you know, the racial mixture, the cultural mixture of Mexican society, which was something that Chicanos were embracing, you know, in a way that countered notions of the American melting pot and assimilation. You know, so that was another, you know, facet of her activism, you know, that appealed to many artists. And I'm just about to lose my third point. But I think, you know, also her very public and brave representation of her own life as an artist, right? And many, if not most, of the artists who were part of, the Chicano civil rights movement were artists that went to art school. They were artists, and they were affirming their right to be that, at a time when the art world was completely ignoring them, when they had to establish their own institutions in order to present their work to a public. So a figure like Frida Kahlo is incredibly deep and resonant with all these different aspects of the lives of Chicano and Chicana artists.
Thank you. I think this will be our last question. I think it's a great way of closing too. So Claudia, if you want to elaborate on that contemporary aspect, and also on the relationship to Latinx, and by that I mean I'm also interpreting queer artists right now, and Frida as an icon of the LGBTQ plus community. But also we have Emma Tenayuca in the question that I think we haven't addressed yet, so I leave it up to you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like Frida is constantly being reckoned with each year. I mean, she's still very present. And it's interesting because some people are like, I'm over it, I can't take anymore. It's just like, enough. When we're seeing it with Rupert doing it, I mean, it's before she was Frida Mania. It's before that. And I think that needs to be put into context. And Emma Tenayuca, I want to make sure Emma Tenayuca gets some play. Emma Tenayuca is becoming, I would say I'm seeing her a little bit more online amongst my Texas networks. She's one of those regional heroes that's always been recognized. She's very famous because she was so young. I think Frida's age also should play a role into this conversation too. I mean, these are very youthful figures that came into prominence. I think Frida's on an international level very different as a visual artist and an icon. I think Emma Tenayuca is representative for her roles in the labor rights movement of San Antonio, and a lot of those movements were affecting women in particular, and she was also part of these political parties and this feminist representative. But she goes into this role eventually where she has to leave because she's a communist, and it's a big deal, and she kind of gets run out of town, and she eventually comes back. Interestingly enough, Emma Tenayuca ends up being a high school teacher at this school called Harlandale High School in San Antonio, Texas, where all of my family members went to school. So I think she was one of these like teachers of my family. But she's like a local legend. So when people reference her, they don't reference her as an older woman, they reference her as this youthful. There's a very specific way one remembers Emma Tenayuca. Same with Frida. It's the portrait. And then Emma Tenayuca, it's often the image within the prison or outside of the prison. It's her in her youthful frame. That's how we decide to remember them in their most impactful roles, so to speak. But they're youthful feminists who played a significant role in Mexican and Mexican American communities. I think, at different levels, unfortunately. But I think eventually Emma could get there if we promote her. But for me as a Texan, she's very present all the time.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. What a treat. Thank you very much for presenting your exhibition on this forum, Dr. Ramos, dear, and Claudia Zapata, dear friends and colleagues. We're very, very, very proud of your work, and we admire it very much.
I want to echo that. And we also just feel so grateful that you presented with Portal about portraiture as we endeavor to study it in an academic way through our scholarly center. And so it's my unfortunate responsibility to close this down. It's just after 6 p.m. I want to thank again, Taína, Claudia, Carmen, just for this really wonderful discussion. I think we've all learned so much. And before we end, I'd like to invite you all to join us again on Tuesday, August 3rd at 5 p.m. here on Zoom, so from the comfort of your homes, for the Greenberg Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. We're going to hear from Dr. Rick Herrera about his lecture titled First in War, First in Peace, First in the Arts of His Countrymen, Charles Wilson Peale, George Washington, and the Visual Creation of American Identity. So that's going to be a lot to absorb, I think. Rick is a professor of strategy at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. And yours truly, I will be moderating the Q&A. So we hope that you can join us, and we're just very grateful you made time. So have a great evening wherever you are, and thank you again.
Thank you for inviting us. We had a wonderful time presenting.
Thank you.